Protestant nobles arrived in Paris for grand royal wedding, believing the wars were finally over. But beneath the celebrations, the city was secretly preparing for one of the most brutal royal betrayals. And massacres in French history, that terrifying night. The palaces and streets filled with nobles, soldiers and royal guests celebrating peace in Paris, completely unaware that secret orders for mass slaughter were already spreading silently between guards and armed men before sunrise that terrifying, deadly night. Suddenly, church bells exploded across Paris at midnight as armed groups stormed through the streets, breaking into homes and slaughtering men and women without mercy, while the royal celebrations collapsed into one of the bloodiest nights in French history. The massacre continued for days across Paris and beyond, transforming the royal wedding into one of the most infamous stories of betrayal and slaughter in European history, after thousands were deceived by promises of peace, before being murdered without mercy. But the royal wedding massacre was not the last story of royal betrayal in Europe. Years later, a Swedish king invited his greatest nobles to celebrate victory inside his castle before the royal one of history's most horrifying political bloodbath. The King of Sweden invited the greatest nobles of the land to celebrate victory and peace, while the halls filled with feasts, wine and music, unaware that the castle doors would soon close behind them and begin one of Europe's most political betrayals. The celebrations continued for days inside the royal castle as the nobles laughed the promises of the new king, while guards and soldiers moved silently the stone corridors preparing for mass executions before that freezing night. Suddenly, the massive castle doors slammed shut as heavily armed soldiers entered the banquet halls and began arresting nobles one by one, while the royal celebration collapsed into screams, panic, and horrifying bloodshed with the flickering candlelight. The next morning, the streets of Stockholm filled with bodies and executions, after the king publicly killed nobles and clergymen, turning the royal victory feast into one of the most infamous political massacres in European history. But the Stockholm Bloodbath was not the end. In Scotland, two young noble boys were invited a luxurious dinner inside a royal castle, before the royal table became one of Europe's most terrifying stories of betrayal and execution. Two young noble boys from one of Scotland's most powerful families were invited to Edinburgh Castle for a royal dinner. Everyone believed the invitation was an attempt at peace. The two boys sat inside the massive stone hall, surrounded by nobles, knights, candles and royal feasts, while the king watched the table with hiding secret orders of execution that terrifying night. Suddenly, the dinner stopped completely when a black bull's head was placed onto the table before the two boys, turning the royal hall into terrifying silence before soldiers rushed forward to arrest the young gentleman. Hours later, the two boys were taken outside the castle and executed despite promises of peace and protection, transforming the royal dinner into one of the most infamous stories of betrayal in Scottish history. But the bloody dinner of Edinburgh was not the last betrayal feast in Europe. Centuries later, a Scottish family welcomed soldiers in their home under the sacred laws of hospitality before everyone awoke to a night to one of Scotland's most horrifying massacres. A Scottish family welcomed soldiers into their mountain home under the ancient laws of hospitality. Everyone ate and drank beside the fire, unaware their own guests were secretly preparing one of the most horrifying betrayals in Scottish history. The nights remained peaceful inside the snow-covered Highland village, as soldiers moved freely between the homes after earning the trust of the villagers. After earning trust of the villagers, secret orders of murder quietly passed between them before the bloody attack at dawn. Suddenly, the village awoke to screams, gunfire and swords, as soldiers began killing the very families who had welcomed them into their homes, turning the quiet mountain settlement into a horrifying frozen nightmare beneath the Scottish storm. At sunrise, bodies covered the frozen snow, while survivors fled into the icy mountains, transforming the Glencoe massacre into one of the most infamous stories of betrayal. It began after two princes disappeared inside a massive royal tower. Two young princes disappeared inside a massive royal tower and were never seen again. Then we move to England, 1483 AD, during the reign of King Richard III. Inside the Royal Tower of London, two young princes disappeared after being imprisoned for their own protection before the fortress became one of the darkest mysteries of royal European history. After the English king died, two young princes were taken to the Tower of London for their own protection, while the people believed it was only a temporary royal decision. Unaware, the boys were entering one of Euroca's darkest mysteries of political terror.
Inside the massive Tower of London, the two princes lived a heavy guard between stone walls and armed soldiers.
While rumours spread through the palace about a bloody struggle for the throne, King Richard III, silently with terrifying mystery...
Suddenly the two princes vanished completely from inside the royal tower after people saw them for the last time near the high stone windows, turning the fortress into a place of political fear, rumours and terrifying mystery. Years passed without anyone discovering the fate of the two princes, transforming the mystery of the Tower Children into one of the most infamous stories of royal betrayal and disappearance in European history. Then we move to Sicily, Palermo, 1282 AD, during the reign of King Charles I of Sicily. After years of French soldiers abusing the population, rage finally exploded during evening prayers beside the churches of Palermo, before the streets descended into one of the most horrifying massacres of revenge in European... After the population exploded violently against the French soldiers, in Sicily during Palermo II, even my Salpano, suddenly the beginning of a horrifying massacre, drowning the ancient city in fire, blood, and cot throughout the entire night. For many years, the people of Sicily lived under French oppression, humiliation, and brutal taxes, while silent rage slowly grew inside the streets of Palermo, until the night violent revenge suddenly exploded against the French and their supporters. During evening prayer beside the churches, the attacks suddenly exploded in the narrow alleys as Palermo descended into bloody chaos, while civilians hunted French soldiers through the burning streets, beneath screams, fire, and terror. Then we moved to England in the year 1 and 2 AD during the reign of Ethelred II. After years of fear from Viking raids, the king secretly ordered the sudden killing of every Viking living inside the English cities, before the night descended into one of the most horrifying massacre trail of Northern European history. In England during the year 1 and 2, King Ethelred II, secretly. In England during Autumn of and 2, the killing of every Viking living inside the English cities, turning the night into one of the most horrifying massacres of betrayal in Northern European history. For many years, the English lived in constant fear of Viking raids that destroyed villages and coastlines, while rage slowly grew across the kingdom, until the king finally decided to unleash bloody revenge against the living inside. In a single night, English forces suddenly attacked violence inside homes, markets, and streets without warning. English cities descended into horrifying chaos filled with screams, fire, smoke, and terror spreading everywhere. With sunrise, the streets of England were filled with bodies and smoke after the lives of thousands of Vikings suddenly collapsed, turning the St. Bright's massacre into one of the most infamous spirals in Northern European history.
Then we moved to Germany in 782 AD during the reign of Mund, King of the Franks. After years of brutal wars against the Saxons, thousands surrendered believing the fighting had ended, before Charlemagne suddenly ordered their mass execution hours, turning Verden into one of the most horrifying massacres in ancient European... In Germany during 782 AD, thousands of Saxons finally surrendered after years of brutal wars, believing the fighting had ended, before their surrender turned into one of the most horrifying massacres of mass execution in ancient European history. After repeated rebellions against the Franks, Charlemagne gathered thousands of Saxon prisoners near the river at Verden, while his armed forces spread across the massive plans beneath a terrifying silence and a storm slowly approaching the battlefield. By the end of the day, the plans of Verden were covered in smoke, blood, and destruction, as the Massacre of Verden became one of the most horrifying mass executions in ancient European history.